The United States government already owns $17 billion worth of Bitcoin that they seized from criminals over the past decade. But that was just the beginning. On March 6th, 2025, President Trump signed an executive order creating something called the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve. The goal? To secretly accumulate 1 million Bitcoin, which represents 5% of all Bitcoin that will ever exist. That's worth $88 billion at today's prices. Here's what should terrify you. They're using something called budget-neutral strategies, which means they're buying Bitcoin with Federal Reserve funds and hidden asset swaps, so it never shows up as a line item that taxpayers can see. While you're watching your savings get destroyed by inflation and regional banks are failing left and right, your government is quietly building the largest Bitcoin reserve in history. They're locking it away for 20 years. While the national debt hits $41 trillion. The system isn't just rigged against you, they're using your money to buy the escape hatch without telling you. Subscribe if you want to understand how they're pulling off the greatest wealth transfer in American history while keeping you completely in the dark about where your tax dollars are really going. The United States federal government has initiated what may be the most sophisticated wealth extraction mechanism in modern monetary history, and it operates through a deliberately obscured Bitcoin accumulation strategy that most Americans remain completely unaware of. While citizens grapple with unprecedented inflation, regional banking instability, and a national debt exceeding $41 trillion, their government has quietly positioned itself to capture approximately 5% of Bitcoin's entire fixed supply through what officials carefully term budget-neutral strategies. This represents roughly 1 million Bitcoin units, a strategic reserve accumulation that fundamentally alters the mechanics of money, reserve assets, and debt management in ways intentionally hidden from public scrutiny. The historical precedent for government strategic reserves extends back centuries, with nations maintaining stockpiles of critical assets outside their day-to-day operational budgets. The United States Strategic Petroleum Reserve, established during the 1970s energy crises, demonstrated how governments could accumulate scarce resources as hedges against future economic disruption. Similarly, the gold reserves stored at Fort Knox represent tangible wealth held separate from circulating currency, providing backing for monetary policy during periods of economic uncertainty. However, the concept of accumulating digital assets as strategic reserves represents an unprecedented evolution in monetary manipulation, one that allows for value extraction on a scale previously impossible through traditional reserve mechanisms. The pivotal moment occurred on March 6th, 2025, when Donald Trump signed Executive Order titled Establishment of the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve and United States Digital Asset Stockpile. This directive mandates that all Bitcoin seized through criminal or civil asset forfeiture proceedings must be deposited into a newly created government reserve, rather than auctioned for immediate cash conversion, as had been standard practice for over a decade. More significantly, the order explicitly authorizes both the Treasury and Commerce Departments to develop comprehensive strategies for acquiring additional Bitcoin holdings, with the critical stipulation that such strategies must remain budget neutral and impose no incremental costs on United States taxpayers. This budget-neutral language represents the most sophisticated aspect of the entire operation, as it provides legal cover for asset acquisition methods that remain deliberately opaque to democratic oversight. The government can now shift existing reserve holdings, manipulate Federal Reserve balance sheets, or engage in complex financial instruments to accumulate Bitcoin without triggering traditional appropriation processes that would require congressional approval or public debate. The mechanism transforms what appears to be fiscally responsible policy into a covert wealth transfer system operating beneath the threshold of public awareness. The timing of this strategic pivot coincides with mounting evidence of systemic banking fragility and accelerating monetary debasement. Regional banks across the United States face increasing stress from commercial real estate exposure and duration risk in their bond portfolios, while the Federal Reserve continues policies that effectively transfer wealth from savers to borrowers through artificially suppressed interest rates. Against this backdrop of financial instability, the government has positioned itself to benefit from potential Bitcoin appreciation, while ordinary citizens bear the consequences of monetary expansion through reduced purchasing power and diminished savings returns. This foundational move establishes the infrastructure for a multi-layered value extraction system that operates through seized asset conversion, legislative authorization for expanded acquisition, and complex financial engineering designed to circumvent traditional oversight mechanisms. The Strategic Bitcoin Reserve represents not merely an investment strategy, but rather the cornerstone of a comprehensive approach to government wealth accumulation that shifts risk away from institutions and toward individual citizens, while concentrating potential rewards within government-controlled holdings that remain locked away from public benefit for decades. The foundation of the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve rests upon a decade-long accumulation of digital assets that federal agencies seized through criminal and civil asset forfeiture proceedings, creating what amounts to a hidden treasury that most Americans never realized their government possessed. Between 2014 and 2024, various federal agencies, including the Department of Justice, Treasury, and Homeland Security, confiscated hundreds of thousands of Bitcoin from darknet marketplace operators, cryptocurrency exchange hackers, money laundering operations, and other criminal enterprises. These seizures represented one of the largest accumulations of Bitcoin by any single entity during the asset's early adoption phase. Yet the government's handling of these holdings reveals a pattern of institutional short-sightedness that ultimately cost American taxpayers billions in unrealized value. The traditional approach to handling seized Bitcoin followed standard asset forfeiture protocols established for physical goods and cash holdings. Federal agencies would take custody of the digital assets, often storing them in government-controlled wallets, then auction them through public sales processes designed to convert the holdings into immediate cash revenue. This liquidation strategy treated Bitcoin as any other seized commodity, prioritizing immediate budget relief for law enforcement agencies over long-term strategic value consideration. The most significant example occurred through a series of auctions conducted between 2014 and 2021, during which approximately 195,000 Bitcoin were sold for a total of roughly $366 million. The mathematical reality of this liquidation strategy exposes one of the most costly institutional failures in modern government asset management. David Sachs, appointed as the White House cryptocurrency policy coordinator, calculated that the government forfeited over $17 billion in unrealized value by choosing immediate cash conversion over strategic holding. This $17 billion opportunity cost represents the difference between the auction prices received and the value those same Bitcoin holdings would command at current market prices. The calculation demonstrates how bureaucratic adherence to traditional asset disposal procedures prevented the government from capitalizing on what would become one of the most significant asset appreciations in financial history. The institutional framework governing these sales reveals deeper structural problems within federal asset management protocols. Law enforcement agencies operated under budgetary pressures that incentivized quick conversion of seized assets into operational funding, creating a systematic bias toward immediate liquidity rather than long-term value preservation. The bureaucratic separation between agencies responsible for asset seizure and those capable of strategic reserve management meant that Bitcoin holdings were treated through the lens of criminal justice funding, rather than national economic policy. This compartmentalized approach prevented any comprehensive evaluation of whether these digital assets might serve broader strategic purposes beyond immediate budget supplementation. The transformation initiated by the March 2025 executive order fundamentally reverses this liquidation approach, converting what had been a pattern of missed opportunities into a deliberate wealth accumulation mechanism. By mandating that future seized Bitcoin must be deposited into the strategic Bitcoin reserve rather than auctioned for cash, the government effectively transforms criminal asset forfeiture into a strategic reserve building operation. This policy shift means that every future Bitcoin seizure adds directly to government wealth rather than providing temporary budget relief, creating a mechanism where criminal prosecutions become inadvertent contributors to Federal Reserve expansion. The historical pattern of premature liquidation now serves as justification for the broader accumulation strategy, with officials pointing to the $17 billion opportunity cost as evidence that strategic holding represents sound fiscal policy rather than speculative investment. The March 6th, 2025 executive order establishing the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve represents a fundamental weaponization of digital asset policy that transforms Bitcoin from seized criminal proceeds into a cornerstone of national monetary strategy. This directive creates two distinct but interconnected mechanisms: the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve itself, which consolidates existing government Bitcoin holdings into a permanent strategic asset, and the broader United States digital asset stockpile, which provides the institutional framework for systematic expansion of government cryptocurrency holdings across multiple digital assets. The order mandates that all federal agencies conduct comprehensive reviews of their Bitcoin holdings within 30 days and transfer these assets into the newly created reserve structure, effectively centralizing what had been scattered holdings across various departments into a unified strategic position. The most critical provision within the executive order establishes that Bitcoin held within the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve shall not be sold under any circumstances, fundamentally altering the government's relationship with these digital assets from temporary custodianship to permanent strategic holding. This no-sale mandate removes what had been consistent selling pressure from the Bitcoin market, as government auctions had historically represented significant supply events that influenced price discovery mechanisms. By eliminating future government sales, the reserve effectively reduces the available Bitcoin supply in circulation, while simultaneously signaling to markets that the United States government views Bitcoin as a strategic asset comparable to gold reserves, rather than a speculative commodity subject to periodic liquidation. The budget neutral acquisition clause represents the most sophisticated aspect of the entire reserve strategy, providing legal authorization for Bitcoin accumulation through mechanisms that circumvent traditional appropriation oversight. This language empowers the Treasury and Commerce Secretaries to develop comprehensive strategies for acquiring additional Bitcoin holdings without triggering congressional budget approval processes or creating visible line items that would alert taxpayers to the true scale of government digital asset investment. The budget neutrality requirement can be satisfied through complex financial engineering, including asset swaps from existing reserve holdings, Federal Reserve balance sheet manipulations, or interagency transfers that maintain fiscal appearance of cost neutrality while enabling massive capital deployment into Bitcoin acquisition. The paradigm shift embedded within this policy framework elevates Bitcoin to the status of digital gold within government reserve management, representing the first time in monetary history that a decentralized digital asset has achieved parity with traditional government reserve assets. This elevation carries profound implications for global monetary dynamics, as other nations observe the United States treating Bitcoin as strategic reserve worthy rather than speculative investment vehicle. The demonstration effect of American Bitcoin reserve creation legitimizes similar policies among allied nations, while potentially forcing adversarial countries to consider their own digital asset accumulation strategies to maintain monetary competitiveness. The market manipulation aspects of the strategic Bitcoin reserve extend beyond simple supply reduction through eliminated sales. The psychological effect of permanent government holding creates artificial scarcity perception among private investors who understand that approximately 198,000 Bitcoin valued at $17.3 billion at implementation has been permanently removed from potential circulation. This scarcity premium amplifies Bitcoin price appreciation beyond levels justified by fundamental adoption metrics, creating wealth effects that primarily benefit early adopters and institutional holders, while ordinary citizens experience the inflationary consequences of expanded government balance sheets without participating in the corresponding asset appreciation. The institutional transformation achieved through the strategic Bitcoin reserve establishes a template for systematic wealth concentration that operates beneath traditional democratic oversight mechanisms, while creating the appearance of fiscally responsible policy through budget-neutral language that obscures the true economic implications of government digital asset accumulation. The legislative and regulatory infrastructure supporting the strategic Bitcoin reserve operates through a deliberately complex web of statutory authorities and bureaucratic mechanisms, designed to enable massive digital asset accumulation while maintaining the appearance of fiscal responsibility and democratic oversight. The foundational legislative framework emerged through proposals such as the Bitcoin Act of 2024, formally designated as Senate Bill 4912, which established statutory authority for federal Bitcoin acquisition and storage operations. This legislation provides the legal foundation necessary for government agencies to treat Bitcoin as a legitimate reserve asset comparable to gold holdings or strategic petroleum reserves, while creating regulatory pathways that circumvent traditional appropriation processes through budget-neutral acquisition strategies. The budget-neutral mandate contained within the executive order creates operational flexibility that enables sophisticated financial engineering approaches to Bitcoin accumulation without triggering congressional spending oversight. These strategies include systematic conversion of existing government reserve assets into Bitcoin equivalent positions, potentially involving liquidation of gold reserves held by the Treasury, conversion of Federal Reserve system holdings, or restructuring of government bond portfolios to create capital for digital asset purchases. The complexity of these asset conversion mechanisms ensures that the true cost and scale of Bitcoin acquisition remains obscured from public scrutiny, as traditional budget analysis methods cannot easily track interagency transfers and asset substitutions that maintain overall balance sheet neutrality while fundamentally altering the composition of government reserves. Federal Reserve involvement in Bitcoin acquisition represents perhaps the most significant expansion of central bank authority in modern monetary history, as the institution gains capability to engage in digital asset operations through special purpose vehicles and complex swap arrangements. These mechanisms enable the Federal Reserve to provide liquidity for government Bitcoin purchases through collateralized credit facilities that use existing government assets as backing, while maintaining separation between traditional monetary policy operations and strategic reserve building activities. The regulatory framework permits creation of intergovernmental transfer arrangements that allow agencies to pool resources for large-scale Bitcoin purchases without individual appropriation requirements, effectively enabling collective government investment in digital assets through bureaucratic coordination rather than legislative authorization. The mathematical implications of acquiring 1 million Bitcoin, representing approximately 5% of the asset's total fixed supply, reveal the unprecedented scale of this wealth concentration strategy. At current market valuations, this acquisition target represents a government investment exceeding $80 billion. Yet the budget-neutral framework enables this massive capital deployment without corresponding increases in federal spending or debt issuance. The mechanism achieves this apparent impossibility through asset substitution strategies that exchange traditional reserve holdings for Bitcoin positions, effectively betting government wealth on digital asset appreciation while maintaining fiscal appearances of responsible budget management. The systematic complexity embedded within these acquisition mechanisms serves multiple strategic purposes beyond simple Bitcoin accumulation. The regulatory framework establishes precedent for government digital asset operations that can be expanded to encompass other cryptocurrencies and blockchain-based assets, creating institutional capability for comprehensive digital wealth concentration as the broader cryptocurrency ecosystem develops. The interagency coordination requirements create bureaucratic momentum that becomes increasingly difficult to reverse once operational, as multiple departments develop institutional interests in maintaining and expanding their digital asset operations. The opacity inherent in budget-neutral acquisition strategies ensures that ordinary citizens cannot evaluate the true risk profile or opportunity cost of government Bitcoin investment, as traditional budget transparency mechanisms fail to capture the economic implications of asset substitution operations that maintain balance sheet neutrality while fundamentally altering government exposure to digital asset volatility and potential appreciation. The strategic Bitcoin reserve operates within a broader economic framework, characterized by unprecedented national debt levels exceeding $41 trillion and mounting evidence of systemic banking fragility, creating conditions where government digital asset accumulation functions as both a hedge against monetary debasement and a sophisticated wealth extraction mechanism that shifts economic risk away from institutions and toward individual citizens. This dual strategy enables the federal government to position itself for potential asset appreciation, while ordinary Americans bear the consequences of fiscal irresponsibility through reduced purchasing power, suppressed savings returns, and increased exposure to inflation and debt servicing obligations. The timing of this Bitcoin accumulation coincides with accelerating regional bank stress, as institutions across the United States face mounting pressure from commercial real estate exposure, duration risk in bond portfolios, and deposit flight toward higher-yielding alternatives, creating systemic vulnerabilities that government policy responses consistently address through mechanisms that socialize losses while privatizing gains. The wealth extraction mechanism embedded within the strategic Bitcoin reserve operates through the systematic concentration of high-growth potential assets within government-controlled holdings while maintaining citizen exposure to low yield, inflation-eroded traditional savings vehicles. By accumulating 1 million Bitcoin and locking these holdings away for extended periods, potentially spanning decades, the government effectively removes significant value creation potential from private markets, while ensuring that any appreciation benefits flow directly to federal reserves rather than individual wealth building. This concentration strategy occurs simultaneously with Federal Reserve policies that suppress interest rates below inflation levels, creating negative real returns for traditional savers, while government reserves are positioned to capture outsized gains from digital asset appreciation. The banking system's role in this wealth extraction framework extends beyond simple monetary policy transmission, as regional bank stress and periodic failures create conditions that justify continued Federal Reserve intervention through quantitative easing, emergency lending facilities, and other mechanisms that expand monetary supply while transferring purchasing power from savers to borrowers and from private citizens to government balance sheets. The systematic suppression of savings, returns through artificially low interest rates, ensures that ordinary citizens cannot achieve wealth preservation through traditional banking relationships, while government entities gain access to high volatility, high potential return assets through budget neutral acquisition strategies that circumvent democratic oversight of investment risk allocation. The transparency deficit inherent in budget-neutral Bitcoin acquisition creates information asymmetries that prevent citizens from evaluating the true cost and risk profile of government digital asset investment. While taxpayers bear ultimate responsibility for federal debt servicing and monetary policy consequences, they lack access to comprehensive information about government Bitcoin holdings, acquisition strategies, risk management protocols, or potential exit strategies that would enable informed democratic evaluation of these investment decisions. This opacity ensures that citizens cannot assess whether government Bitcoin accumulation represents sound fiscal policy or speculative investment that places public resources at risk for institutional benefit rather than broader economic welfare. The structural design of this wealth concentration mechanism creates a systematic transfer of economic opportunity from individual savers to government institutions, as private citizens experience purchasing power erosion through inflation, while government reserves accumulate assets positioned for potential exponential appreciation. The mathematical reality of this arrangement means that any significant Bitcoin price appreciation primarily benefits government coffers rather than citizen wealth, while inflation and debt servicing costs continue flowing toward taxpayers regardless of digital asset performance. This asymmetric risk allocation represents a fundamental transformation of the relationship between citizen economic welfare and government fiscal policy, where institutional upside potential increases, while individual downside exposure expands through mechanisms deliberately designed to obscure the true nature of this wealth transfer from democratic oversight and citizen understanding. The current operational reality of the strategic Bitcoin reserve reveals the most audacious wealth concentration mechanism in modern monetary history, as the United States government has already accumulated approximately 198,000 Bitcoin valued at $17.3 billion, while actively pursuing expansion toward the stated goal of 1 million Bitcoin, representing 5% of the asset's entire fixed supply and approximately $88 billion at present market valuations. This accumulation strategy operates through the systematic removal of Bitcoin from circulating supply, while government holdings remain permanently locked away from market access, creating artificial scarcity conditions that drive price appreciation benefiting institutional holders, while ordinary citizens experience the inflationary consequences of expanded government balance sheets without participating in corresponding asset appreciation. The mathematical inevitability of this wealth transfer becomes apparent when examining the relationship between fixed Bitcoin supply, growing government accumulation, and the purchasing power erosion experienced by citizens holding depreciating fiat currency. The pathway toward 1 million Bitcoin holdings operates through multiple concurrent acquisition mechanisms that deliberately circumvent traditional budgetary oversight, while maintaining the appearance of fiscal responsibility through budget-neutral language that obscures the true scale of capital deployment into digital assets. Internal Treasury discussions and legislative frameworks, including the Bitcoin Act, establish the institutional authority necessary for systematic asset substitution strategies, where existing government reserves, including gold holdings, foreign exchange reserves, and Federal Reserve System assets can be converted into Bitcoin positions without triggering appropriation processes or creating visible budget line items that would alert taxpayers to the magnitude of government digital asset investment. This conversion process enables the government to deploy tens of billions of dollars into Bitcoin acquisition while maintaining plausible deniability regarding incremental taxpayer costs, as asset substitution maintains overall balance sheet neutrality despite fundamentally altering government exposure to digital asset volatility and potential appreciation. The market manipulation effects of permanent government Bitcoin accumulation extend far beyond simple supply reduction, as the no-sale mandate creates psychological scarcity premiums that amplify price appreciation beyond levels justified by fundamental adoption metrics or utility considerations. Private market participants understand that government holdings represent permanently sterilized supply that will never return to circulation, creating artificial demand pressure as the available Bitcoin supply for private ownership continues shrinking while institutional and government accumulation accelerates. This scarcity dynamic ensures that any significant Bitcoin price appreciation primarily flows toward government reserves rather than citizen wealth building, while inflation and monetary expansion continue eroding the purchasing power of traditional savings held by ordinary Americans. The transparency deficit surrounding government Bitcoin operations represents perhaps the most insidious aspect of this wealth extraction mechanism, as citizens bear ultimate responsibility for federal debt servicing and monetary policy consequences, while lacking access to comprehensive information about acquisition costs, risk management protocols, holding strategies, or potential exit plans that would enable democratic evaluation of government investment decisions. The budget-neutral acquisition framework ensures that traditional budget analysis methods cannot track the true scale or cost of Bitcoin accumulation, while asset substitution strategies obscure the opportunity costs associated with converting traditional reserves into highly volatile digital assets that may experience dramatic value fluctuations. The inevitable conclusion of this systematic wealth concentration reveals the modern evolution of monetary system manipulation, where debt monetization, hidden reserve accumulation, and institutional capture of upside potential combine with citizen exposure to downside risks through inflation, debt servicing obligations, and suppressed savings returns. This represents the definitive rigging of the monetary system in favor of institutions that control both fiat currency creation and strategic reserve asset accumulation, while ordinary savers find their economic agency systematically undermined through mechanisms deliberately designed to concentrate wealth within government coffers, while socializing the costs and risks across the broader population.